Open on a close-up of a medicine cabinet, white plastic shelves, morning light, the hiss of a shower in the background, a hand reaches in, automatic, practiced, barely conscious, and closes around a small round pill. The Bayer logo catches the light. Look at that hand. That's not a dramatic gesture. That's routine. That's Tuesday morning. That's the completely unremarkable act of trusting a company you've never actually met, whose labs you've never entered, whose board you've never seen, whose decision-making rooms are closed to every person who has ever swallowed one of their products. That cross, that clean white cross on that cheerful box. For most of human history, the cross meant sanctuary. It meant you are safe here. Bayer built a civilization out of that reflex. They spent over a century polishing the surface of that symbol until it shone, until the trust it triggered was nearly involuntary, like flinching from heat. You don't decide to trust Bayer. You've been conditioned to. But here is what they didn't include on the label. The boardrooms where men in suits calculated acceptable suffering in columns of projected revenue. The medical journals they quietly funded. The governments they worked alongside, not as suppliers, but as architects. The children whose nervous systems were the first test beds for what would become the most addictive substances of the modern age. The prisoners who never agreed to be part of any trial. The rivers that ran colors that shouldn't exist in nature. Not accidents, not the unavoidable cost of progress. A method, a system, a pattern that repeats itself across 160 years with stunning consistency. Different products, different decades, different headlines, same logic. You've been conditioned to trust this logo as a symbol of relief and safety. But if you could scrape away the white paint of history, you wouldn't see molecules of healing. You would see blood, mass addiction, and the birth of the most destructive substances ever unleashed on humanity. Welcome to the real story of Bayer. Welcome to the Devil's Pharmacy. In the next hour, we're going to follow this company from a dye factory in the middle of 19th century Germany to the corridors of power that shaped 2 world wars, and then further still into the operating rooms, courtrooms, and regulatory hearings of the present day. Because what you're about to learn doesn't end in 1945. It doesn't end with an apology or a verdict or a rebranding campaign. What you're about to learn hasn't ended at all. Wuppertal, 1863. Where it began. To understand how a company becomes this, you have to go back to the beginning. And the beginning is not pretty, but it is ordinary. Aggressively, almost disappointingly ordinary. The year is 1863. The place is Barmen, a grimy industrial town folded into the narrow valley of the Wupper River in western Germany. The river ran in colors back then, not metaphorically, but literally. Upstream, the textile dye factories dumped their chemical waste directly into the water. Some days the Wupper ran cobalt blue. Some days it ran a deep, bruised purple. The locals had stopped noticing. Friedrich Bayer, a textile salesman, and Johann Friedrich Westcott, a master dyer, founded their company in a shed. No grand vision, no declaration of healing. They made synthetic dyes for fabric, and they made them well enough to turn a modest profit in a region crowded with competitors doing the same thing. This is the detail that matters most about Bayer's origin. It was a chemical company first. The relationship to the human body, to medicine, to pain, to life and death, came later. And it came sideways, not from a tradition of healing, but from a tradition of manipulating molecules for money. By the 1870s, the company had grown. They hired trained chemists. They built laboratories. They began filing patents on everything, not just products, but processes, precursors, methods. Patents were the real currency. Control the process, and you control the market, regardless of who else tries to enter it. This was the first lesson Bayer mastered before they ever produced a single pharmaceutical. Intellectual property as a weapon. They had no interest in making medicine. They were looking for new markets for their chemical expertise. The human body just happened to be the most profitable frontier available. 1898, two molecules that changed everything. Here is where the story fractures, where Bayer's history splits into two realities running on parallel tracks, and the company learned to keep only one of them visible. The year is 1898. Inside Bayer's laboratory in Elberfeld, a young chemist named Heinrich Drieser is overseeing trials on two recently synthesized compounds. Two products, developed almost simultaneously. Two chemicals that will alter the 20th century in ways nobody in that lab could fully imagine. The first compound is acetyl salicylic acid. Bayer will call it aspirin. The second compound is diacetylmorphine. Bayer will call it heroin. Yes, that heroin. Let that sit for a moment. The same company, the same laboratory, the same year, the same chemists. One product that would become the world's most recognized over-the-counter painkiller, and one that would ignite a global addiction crisis that still burns today. Bayer did not stumble onto heroin by accident. They synthesized it deliberately. They tested it deliberately, and they marketed it deliberately. Drieser's internal assessments described the new compound as a heroic painkiller, the German word heroisch, which is how it got its brand name. They gave it a brand name because they intended to sell it at scale, and sell it they did. Bayer marketed heroin across Europe and North America as a non-addictive substitute for morphine. They promoted it as a cough suppressant for tuberculosis patients. They recommended it for children, specifically for children, as a treatment for what they called irritability and respiratory problems. Think about that image, not an abstract statistic. A specific image, a mother in 1900 standing at a pharmacy counter in Cincinnati or Hamburg or Buenos Aires, handing over coins, receiving a small glass bottle with a Bayer label, and going home to administer the recommended dose to her coughing 6-year-old child. Bayer's own medical literature promoted this. The company had early evidence, from their own trials, that heroin produced dependency. Drieser's team documented withdrawal symptoms. The data existed inside those laboratory walls, and then a decision was made, not to halt the product, not to narrow the indication, but to continue, to expand, to export, to print more pamphlets in more languages for more markets. They knew. They continued. By 1913, Bayer was producing over a ton of heroin per year and exporting it to 23 countries. It wasn't until 1914, when the United States passed the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, that any meaningful regulatory wall began to rise. By then, the dependency infrastructure was already built. The patients were already patients. The supply chains were already running. Bayer eventually lost its trademark on heroin in 1919 as part of the Treaty of Versailles, a small footnote in the company's history, presented over the following decades as evidence that they were penalized enough, that the account was settled. It wasn't settled. It was buried. And the aspirin kept selling. Clean, white, trusted, the cross on every box. IG Farben and the Architecture of Industrial Murder. This is the chapter they spend the least time on in the official histories, the one where the word complicated does a lot of heavy lifting. By the 1920s, Bayer had merged with 6 of Germany's largest chemical companies to form a single industrial conglomerate, IG Farben Industrie AG, known simply as IG Farben. It was, at the time, the largest chemical corporation on Earth. And in 1933, when the National Socialist government consolidated power in Germany, IG Farben did not resist. They adapted. IG Farben provided the fuel that ran the Luftwaffe. They produced the synthetic rubber that kept the Wehrmacht's vehicles rolling. They manufactured the explosives. They co-financed propaganda campaigns. They sat on joint committees with SS officers to coordinate wartime industrial production. and at the Auschwitz concentration camp complex, specifically at a facility called Monowitz, also known as Auschwitz III. IG Farben built a synthetic rubber plant using forced labor from the camp. Not contracted labor, not poorly paid labor. Forced labor. Prisoners, men, women, and children, classified by the Nazi state as subhuman, worked until they died or were sent to the gas chambers when their productivity declined. IG Farben executives made site visits. They reviewed production quotas. They corresponded with SS administration about labor allocations, about how many bodies the camp could supply to the factory, and at what rate of attrition the supply could be maintained. The word attrition appears in their internal correspondence in reference to human beings, and it gets worse. One of Bayer's own subsidiaries, operating under the IG Farben umbrella, purchased human subjects directly from the SS to conduct pharmaceutical experiments. The documented correspondence is precise, clinical. A letter from a Bayer official to the SS commandant at Auschwitz reads, in effect, "We are taking delivery of the women. They will be used for testing. We will report results." They were testing drug compounds on prisoners who had no knowledge of what was being administered to them, people who had no recourse. People whose deaths generated paperwork and nothing else, not rogue scientists acting alone. Corporate policy, approved purchases, filed receipts. After the war, 24 IG Farben executives were tried at the Nuremberg tribunals, specifically at what became known as the IG Farben trial of 1947 and 1948. 13 were convicted. The heaviest sentence handed down was 8 years in prison. 8 years for participation in industrial-scale enslavement and the deliberate use of concentration camp prisoners as pharmaceutical test subjects. Most were out by 1951. Several returned to executive positions in the successor companies that emerged from the post-war dismantling of IG Farben. One of those successor companies, reconstituted, renamed, rebranded, was Bayer AG. The executives who had written the letters about taking delivery of human beings rejoined the company they had helped turn into a war machine. They brought their Rolodexes, their institutional knowledge, their uninterrupted professional networks, and Bayer printed new stationery. Rehabilitation and the science of forgetting. There is a particular skill that large corporations develop better than almost any other institution, better than governments, better than churches, better than armies. It is the skill of continuing to operate, continuing to grow, continuing to produce and distribute and profit and expand, while the evidence of what they did recedes not through confrontation or accountability, but through the sheer accumulative weight of new business. Every new aspirin sold adds another layer of white paint. By the 1950s and into the 1960s, Bayer was rebuilding aggressively. New products, new partnerships, new territories. The post-war Western economic expansion created enormous demand for pharmaceuticals, agricultural chemicals, and industrial materials, and Bayer was positioned to supply all three. They invested in research, filed patents, and assembled the kind of scientific credibility that makes inquiry seem almost impolite. Who asks the chemistry teacher about the chemistry teacher's past? But the past kept surfacing, not loudly, not in ways that interrupted the quarterly earnings calls, but persistently in the testimony of survivors, in the deliberations of historians, in the legal filings of plaintiffs who had not forgotten. In 1957, a Bayer-affiliated pharmaceutical company was involved in the development and distribution of thalidomide, a sedative prescribed to pregnant women across Europe, Canada, and Australia for morning sickness. The result was one of the most catastrophic drug disasters in modern medical history. An estimated 10,000 children born with severe limb deformities and thousands more stillbirths linked to the compound. The warning signs had been there. The teratogenic effects, the capacity of the drug to interfere with fetal development, had been flagged in animal studies. The data had been available to the regulators and to the companies selling the drug. The decision was made to continue. The market was too good, and Bayer, which had purchased stakes in the pharmaceutical network through which thalidomide moved, walked away from the catastrophe with settlements that, measured against total revenue, barely registered. The families of children who grew up without arms or legs, they remember the number differently. From aspirin to pesticides to GMO dominance. We have to talk about Monsanto. In 2018, after a years-long acquisition process, Bayer completed its $63 billion purchase of Monsanto, the American agricultural giant that had, over the preceding decade, become perhaps the most controversial corporation in the world. Bayer's leadership publicly framed the acquisition as a transformative investment in the future of food and agriculture, progress, innovation, feeding a growing planet. They quietly announced they would retire the Monsanto name. Think about that decision for a moment. When you pay $63 billion for a company and then immediately erase its name from every product and building and press release, you are not just rebranding. You are performing institutional amnesia on an industrial scale. The Monsanto name carried too much gravity. The lawsuits, the PCB contamination of Anniston, Alabama, where internal documents showed the company had known for decades that their chemical plant was poisoning the town's water, soil, and residents, and had continued operating while suppressing the evidence. The Agent Orange legacy, the Roundup litigation involving tens of thousands of plaintiffs who alleged that glyphosate, Monsanto's flagship herbicide, had caused their non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Bayer absorbed the company and absorbed the liability. At last count, Bayer has agreed to pay over $10 billion in settlements related to Roundup/glyphosate claims. The litigation is ongoing. New plaintiffs continue to file, and Roundup is still on the shelves, not recalled, not reformulated, not removed, still sold in the same orange bottle to homeowners and farmers across the country, because settling lawsuits, even at $10 billion, is cheaper than losing a product line that generates billions annually. This is the calculus. This has always been the calculus. The numbers change. The equation does not. How a brand survives everything. So how does a company with this history maintain the kind of public trust that allows a person to reach into their medicine cabinet on a Tuesday morning and pull out a Bayer product without a moment's hesitation? The answer is architecture. Deliberate, multi-layered, enormously expensive architecture. It begins with volume. Bayer operates in over 100 countries. They produce thousands of products across pharmaceutical, consumer health, and agricultural divisions. The sheer mass of normal, legitimate, functional products creates a statistical fog around the harmful ones. It continues with philanthropy, Bayer Foundation grants, global health partnerships, malaria research programs, cancer research collaborations, academic endowments. Each of these is real. The medicines exist. The research is genuine. And each initiative generates precisely the kind of press coverage and institutional goodwill that makes the rest harder to see. It accelerates through regulatory capture, the slow, legal, entirely normalized process by which the companies being regulated become deeply embedded in the agencies regulating them. Through lobbying expenditures, through the revolving door of executives who move between industry and regulatory bodies, through the funding of the scientific journals that publish the safety data, through the construction of evidentiary standards that favor incumbents. This is not conspiracy. This is infrastructure. And it concludes, or rather it perpetuates, through the basic psychology of brand familiarity. The cross on the aspirin box is not just a logo. It is a decades-long deposit into a trust account that was opened before most people alive today were born. The compound interest on that familiarity is almost impossible to overcome with facts alone, which is why they're not afraid of documentaries. They're not afraid of books or investigative articles or legal verdicts. They're afraid of something far simpler and far rarer: sustained collective memory. Go back to that medicine cabinet, the hand, the pill, the cross catching the morning light. The product in that hand may work exactly as advertised. Bayer does produce real medicine. The aspirin will reduce your fever. That is true. But what else is true? It is true that this company administered heroin to children and called it a cough remedy. It is true that this company's industrial predecessor used concentration camp prisoners as pharmaceutical test subjects and purchased them for that purpose with company funds. It is true that the executives who supervised those decisions were reintegrated into the company's leadership after serving minimal sentences. It is true that this company's acquired subsidiary spent decades concealing evidence that its products were poisoning communities and causing cancer. It is true that the lawsuits are still being filed, the settlements still being calculated, the products still being sold. None of this is allegation. Every element is documented in court records, in Nuremberg transcripts, in internal correspondence, in regulatory filings. The question isn't whether this happened. The question is, what does it mean that we know and still reach for the bottle? What does it mean that a company can move through heroin distribution, war crime complicity, and mass tort liability across 160 years and still command the automatic trust of billions of people who have never heard most of this story? The answer to that question is not just about Bayer. It's about every white cross on every clean box in every medicine cabinet, in every home where someone reaches in on a Tuesday morning, barely awake, barely thinking, trusting a system they didn't design, can't inspect, and were never invited to question. That system was built deliberately, and in the next chapter, we're going to show you exactly who built it and why they're still building. The history of Bayer is documented in Nuremberg trial transcripts, German federal archives, U.S. federal court records, and peer-reviewed historical scholarship. Nothing in this documentary has been invented.